I think for a lot of people, their only contact with history is through fiction. But unbeknownst to him, the cloth contained fleas, and the fleas contained the bubonic plague. Essentially, the community had to make a really tough decision. I want to be authentic and I want to tell the stories.
Hello and welcome to this interview in the series that we're doing with authors of fiction and non-fiction, particularly looking at research around historical books. Today I'm joined by Anna Jensen, who's in South Africa and is enjoying the sunshine while we in England are enjoying the not so sunshine. It's a bit chilly here.
Yes. Yeah. Although it's raining today, so at least we've got a bit of rain today.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me, Anna. So you've written a book. We've written a couple of books now about novels with historical element to it, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. But what got you into writing historical fiction in the first place?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's really great to have an opportunity to have a chat and just kind of encourage people to, look at the whole idea of historical fiction and how to write and how to do the research and all of that sort of thing. For myself, I got into it kind of through the experience of, when you visit a place and you maybe go there and you kind of have a sense of, there's other people who've been here before and there's a story to be told. And for myself, what I was originally going to do was for a couple of the places that I've written about, places I've visited, and then I was going to actually write nonfiction and just kind of sort of write about how I've been impacted by the specific places that I've been to. And then I kind of got started on that. And someone actually said to me, that particular story would lend itself to a novel rather. So I thought, yeah, maybe I could give that a go. And so I knew nothing about novel writing or even writing fiction because I've previously written nonfiction and poetry and that sort of thing. But then there was the November NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month.
Yes.
And someone suggested to me, why don't you try starting a novel for the NaNoWriMo? So I did that a couple of years ago, and actually a really great way to kind of just get it written down and get a story plotted out and in place. And so that was where I started. And then from there, I've written another one and planning a third. So
we'll talk about in a moment just about your first book. So what genre would you say it is? I mean, a lot of the people I've spoken to recently have been writing sort of historical fiction, romantic fiction, that sort of thing. What genre would you describe yours as being in?
Definitely not romance. I don't really write romance novels.
That's good.
There's obviously a bit of there's friendship and, that's the relationships in there, obviously, because that's real life. But what inspires me personally the most is the idea of ordinary people just living out their ordinary life, but with an extraordinary God. And as we do that, and as individuals do that, they change history. And so for me, that's what really inspires me to tell the stories, because I like telling stories about pretty ordinary people who just get on with what's in front of them to do. But then in the course of doing that, they literally change history, and I think it's such an encouragement for us that sometimes we just think, why am I doing what I'm doing? But who knows, in 100 years time, 200 years time, 50 years time, who knows what impact just getting on with what's in front of us to do can have. So
there's a spiritual element to the books that you
write. There is. Yeah. I don't
component.
I have the spiritual element and the kind of bringing that in. The first book had a lot of Christian input because of the nature of the story and the involvement of the church in that particular story. And then the second one, I've alluded to Christian ideas, and I've spoken about a bit of C.S. Lewis's books and radio shows and so on. Maybe not kind of quoting scripture all over the place and that sort of thing, but it's very definitely from the Christian perspective that I write.
So the first book that you wrote is set in a village, an English village affected by plague. This is the village of Eyam. Is it Eyam?
Eyam.
Eyam.
So it's kind of, although it's spelled Eyam, but it's actually pronounced more like double E-M.
Eyam. Eyam. As with so many English villages, and towns, even the pronunciation is not what you expect.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. So, very English. Very English.
So where is Eyam in the UK?
So Eyam is in Derbyshire, which is in the north of England. I grew up maybe 10 miles away from Eyam in the city of Sheffield.
Right.
And so as a child, it was one of those places. It's a well-known kind of tourist place to visit.
Yes,
so whenever we had people come visit us in Sheffield, we always piled into the car and took them off to Eyam so they could kind of see the place. And I did various school trips there. So it was a place which certainly, as I say, the whole thing of visiting an area and having a sense of something has happened here before. Very much that's what Eyam has been like for me. I've kind of grown up with it as part of my upbringing, really, to visit the area and to get to grips with the story.
Right. Yes. I was looking back at my own photographs because we visited Eyam a few years back, 2014. I realised, so it's almost about 8 years ago now. Tell us a bit about what happened at Eyam, not about your book specifically, but about the background stories.
So the story takes place basically during 1665, 1666.
Okay, so just after the English Civil War, then.
Yes, exactly. So it was right at the end of that. We've got everyone coming back to London, and kind of everything's all now happening again, and Parliament's open, and the King's Court, and so on and so on. And unfortunately, a plague was brought into London, which is where it was primarily the population's primarily affected in London. But what happened this time was that for a lot of people, the kind of aristocratic society left London and went to various different country areas. And obviously, for some of them, they did take the plague to those areas.
Right.
Eyam was slightly different. Eyam is like maybe 160 miles, I think, kind of north of London.
Yeah.
So in many ways was, London had nothing, they didn't really have anything to do with London in many ways. It was like a distant, the streets are paved with gold, kind of mythical sort of capital city. But what actually happened was there was a tailor who lived and worked in the village of Eyam, and he had requested a parcel of cloth to be brought to him from London.
Right.
And cloth arrived, but unbeknownst to him, the cloth contained fleas, and the fleas contained the bubonic plague.
Right.
So the fleas had obviously, kind of traveled up in this cloth, and presumably had sort of lain dormant in the cloth for a long period of time, with it all being folded up and so on.
Yeah.
Then when it arrived in the village and they unpacked the cloth, unfortunately, the tailor and his family and a guy called George Vickers, who was his kind of helper who brought the cloth up from London, unfortunately were bitten by the fleas and contracted the plague. And within a very short period of time, the plague was then literally hopping from house to house, unfortunately. And essentially the community had to make a really tough decision. What do they do with this disease which had now arrived at their doorstep? What was the right response in terms of the wider community? They were very close to the major industrial hubs of Sheffield and Chesterfield. And so there was the concern that it would, that if it reached those areas, that obviously that would cause a major problem. And so I won't give a spoiler, but they took a decision that the surrounding countryside and the surrounding communities remained safe and plague free, but it had a heavy consequence for the community of Eyam.
Yeah. So they made a tough choice on behalf of other people. A tough
choice, they really did. And what attracted me to the story, in large part, apart from having grown up in the area, and so, I've kind of seen the actual properties, and I've kind of know the names of all the various villages and so on from quite a young age. The story revolved a lot around the local church. Right. So at the time, the old non-conformist kind of Cromwell supporting church leaders were all expelled from the Church of England, and they were given strict instructions. It was against the law for them to stay within a 5-mile radius of their original parish. But in the case of Eyam, their nonconformist pastor, a guy called Thomas Stanley, he was very well liked by the community, and so they actually found him a cottage for him to stay in, and a few of them still had secret meetings with him. It was illegal for them to meet in public, but they still met with him. And then a new person was appointed to the role of vicar of St. Lawrence Church, and he wasn't so well liked. He was called William Mompesson. He wasn't so well liked by the community, but obviously, as the figurehead within the community, he was the one who had to make a lot of the decisions and kind of encourage the villagers to go with what his idea was. So what was very interesting was that both him and Stanley ended up working together, even though theologically, ideologically, politically, they were very different.
Yeah.
But actually, for the good of the wider community, they came together, and they actually combined forces and were able to persuade the villagers to go with the plan of attack that they came up with.
So I mean, and obviously, plague, people die.
Yeah.
So
yes, you can guess. Yeah.
It's hard. It's tough stuff. So, but that happened, as you said, back in the 1660s. I mean, it's a long time ago. I mean, I do a lot of research for the early 1800s, which was like a good 150 years or so later than that, and that could be tough. You're going back to the 1660s, then. So you tell a compelling story there of what happened, but how much evidence actually is there? How did you approach that?
Do you know, it's amazing. I think that even at the time, I think that maybe there was a sense that people maybe knew that what they were doing was extraordinary, because the parish records have been very well maintained. You know, even at the time, obviously, you'd record births, marriages, and deaths. Interestingly, that those records have been well preserved. So I think it's almost, as I say, maybe at the time, it's almost as though they knew that there was a need to preserve the story and to keep a record. The main source of information is partly the parish records, which are obviously they have actually now been digitalized, which is great. So you can look on some of the family history websites, and you can actually look up Eyam and you can see some of those records there.
Yeah.
But then in around the early 1800s, there was a few people who, for whatever reason, decided to recount the story. One of the what his name was, William Wood, I think his name was. He wrote an account of the Eyam story, which is quite romanticized, and it's quite, it's sort of very, the villagers were very happy, even though maybe they actually weren't. It's quite a, it's one of those sort of quite, Victorian melodramatic kind of tellings that's a bit romanticized and a little bit, pastoral. Kind of describes all of the fields and the flowers and all that sort of thing. But actually, his account is incredibly helpful to read, because he has, again, I think he's used the parish records. He's obviously taken individuals' memories and accounts that they've recorded. I think William Mompesson, although there's nothing of his available to read at the moment, I think that probably he had a diary that he recorded things in, and that William Wood obviously used that. Then at the time, there were also a few people who wrote plays and also stories. So there's more information about Eyam than actually you'd expect.
Right.
And the village now, present time, very much preserves that history. And so it's actually quite relatively easy, actually, to find the information and to get a good idea of what was happening. And then there's also, generally in terms of the period, obviously there's Samuel Pepys's diary,
Yes.
which I read through quite a lot, just to get a flavor of what the environment was like. And obviously he was in London, so it was very different, but he does give accounts of the plague. He does talk about the kind of church reformation that was taking place. And he does take a few excursions out to the countryside. So you get a bit of an idea of what that was like. And then there's a couple of other books that I was able to get hold of that were specifically about Restoration Britain, which were fascinating to read. You know, and they give an account of what the newspapers were like at the time, what the clothing was at the time. And obviously, you know, that's all kind of gathered, it saves me having to find the information, you know, it's all gathered into one book, which is actually quite helpful. So I was pleasantly surprised, actually, by how much information was available and how much of it is on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the internet access is really valuable, isn't it, for someone like you? Because you're doing, I mean, you've been there a long time ago, but when was the last time you went to Eyam?
It was actually about 20 years ago, 18 years ago.
So a good few years before you wrote the book.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, a long time. Yeah. So I mean, I would have liked to have done a trip, but unfortunately COVID hit, so I wasn't able to get over. And it was partly because of COVID that I ended up writing the story, because at the time when COVID was happening and everyone was being locked down and all of those sort of fun things that we had to endure, it was amazing to see international newspapers were talking about the village of Eyam and were talking about William Mompesson and Thomas Stanley. And I was just like, wow, you know, these people, they paid the ultimate price and they just got on and did it. Did they really think that in 300 years' time, people would be looking to them for inspiration? And again, it's just that thing of they were just doing what they felt was the right thing to do. And a lot of people would say, well, maybe it wasn't right. Maybe they didn't, you know, medically they didn't understand how the plague was spread and so on. But still, they made a decision which has impacted us 300 years later, which I think is quite remarkable.
Yes, I guess as a marketing opportunity, COVID would have been great for your book, except it was a bit...
Yeah, exactly.
Next time around, there will be another pandemic, unfortunately. These things do come around again.
They do, unfortunately.
But coming back to the question about the internet, so the internet obviously is making it very easy for people like you who are far from the UK to do your research.
Yeah.
You've got access to so many books.
Yeah, and I think also, you know, it's also the online, you know, the online archives are also amazing. You know, as I say, we were able to look at the actual parish records online. Obviously, you can look at the Kew archives. Most of that you can look at online without actually having to come over to London. It's preferable to do it in person if you can, because I think obviously when you do it in person, you also meet the individuals who are caring for those records and have maybe, you know, background information that they don't know is going to be useful. That actually is highly valuable. I think you can get the bare facts off the internet, but I don't know how often you get the emotion connected to the facts. But I guess that's kind of the writer's job, is to take bare facts and weave them into a story that then creates emotion.
Yes, because the archivists at the end of the day, that they perhaps know of other sources or can make connections, but they too are remote from the events themselves.
No, that's right. So I mean, for myself, writing the story of Eyam, the most amazing thing for me was that in the process I emailed a couple of people. So I emailed the museum to see if there was anybody there who was able to get involved and just help me with some of the research. And I also emailed St. Lawrence's Church just to say, you know, obviously you were the church, amazingly the same church, you know, and they hold a memorial service every year, even now, to the plague victims. And so I contacted them and got in touch eventually after a bit of to and froing. And then eventually somebody contacted me who said she was the descendant of one of the key people in the story of Eyam from the mid 1660s. And that was incredible because she was able to give me, I mean, talk about, you know, firsthand information of her family story and how she discovered and how they found that actually they were part of the Eyam story. And in fact, they were when they were looking for COVID vaccines and so on, they actually approached the family to try and find out, you know, what was the genetic reason why they didn't get the plague, or why they were able to recover from the plague, and how could that maybe help with research for COVID. It was like amazing. And I think those are the things that you can't get off the internet.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
just don't get that kind of connection. And at the end of the day, as a writer, I want to bring the personal connection. I don't just want to regurgitate facts, because you can buy a textbook for that.
Yes, you really want to bring it to life. So what would you say was the biggest challenge when it came to researching your book?
For me, the biggest challenge was, I think, kind of taking the massive information and deciding which bits were relevant and which bits kind of were for my own background information, but I didn't need to stuff the book full of those facts and figures. So, for example, the book on Restoration Britain was wonderful, absolutely fantastic read, and the same with Samuel Pepys. You know, an amazing read. But do I really need to add that into the story? And I think sometimes when there's lots and lots of information, it can become quite difficult to, you know, I'm so immersed in the story. So for me, it's all really interesting and I'm loving it. And I kind of want to tell you everything that I've learned. But actually, for the reader who's wanting just an enjoyable read for the weekend, you know, they maybe don't want to kind of know everything about what Samuel Pepys ate for lunch and, you know, that sort of thing. So I think for me, that was a big thing. And I think then the other side of it is also, for myself, I really want to be as accurate as I can be. And so I think there can come that little bit of a perfectionist element of then not daring to put anything down on paper in case I've got it a bit wrong. Which, you know, when you're writing about the mid-1600s, kind of doesn't matter as much, because nobody's now alive, so they can't actually correct me. But I think, you know, when you write about more recent history, it's quite a difficult thing, because people might remember, or they might have family members who kind of lived through certain events, and I'm busy writing about them, and actually I'm not representing the story well. So that was why I really appreciated being able to get in touch with the church and with the museum, who were able to give me valuable feedback to say, yes, that was accurate, or you know, you've misrepresented that, or whatever.
So has anyone been in touch about to say, actually, I'm not sure about the history here, or indeed have you afterwards reflected and thought, actually, maybe that wasn't quite right?
No, not with this one. I must say, with this particular story, I actually, so when I contacted the museum and I was saying, would they like a few copies of the book, they beforehand wanted a local historian to read it. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, here we go. Now we're going to find all the holes in the story that I've missed out. And she wrote an amazing response and basically said it was one of the best novels that she'd read based on Eyam, and the most accurate. And that actually the one thing I'd really tried to do was bring out this relationship between the two ministers, you know, the previous and then the current. And she basically said it was one of the best examples of exploring that relationship that she'd come across. So that was really great. Joan did send me, Joan is the descendant of one of the people in the story. She made a couple of comments which were very interesting. So one of them was in London during the plague, what they actually did was they painted red crosses on the doors so that people knew that the plague had been there. And I just assumed that had been done everywhere. So I wrote that into the book, and she messaged me and said, oh no, they didn't do that in Eyam because everybody knew everybody. So obviously they didn't need to put a cross on the door, because they'd have known it was my neighbor. Yeah. But so little things like that. And I loved that, you know, that she was like, oh, nobody would mind. But I thought, but that's really good, because that's actually very different to what it would have been like in London. And I think just to be able to bring in some of those little differences, I think is what makes the story more, makes it more real, I suppose, because you've included something that seems quite insignificant, but actually is more accurate in terms of what would have happened.
So was she reading an early version? Are the red crosses
yeah. So I sent
now?
her, it was all finished, but then before I actually published, I did send it through, and she said, you know, she was happy and thought that it was that I'd done the story well.
Yeah.
But then there was that, and then I think there was one other thing which I'd included. I can't remember what it was. There was something that I'd included, and she was like, it wasn't quite like that here, but similar, so you can keep it in. But it was quite interesting just getting someone else's input on that.
So she was being a beta reader for you then, somebody who was reading the almost finished version just to make sure there aren't any.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I didn't send it to her with all of the, you know, it had been edited, so it didn't have all of the grammar and all that. She didn't have to sort through grammar and spelling mistakes. But in terms of accuracy, and I actually think it's really valuable if there is somebody around who can give some kind of a feedback. Either they have studied the period, or they you know, they have personal knowledge of the story or something like that. I actually think if it's possible to, then that's wonderful, because again, you can't get that off the internet. You know, you don't know. I think when writing, it's easy to assume I've got all of the information and all of the data, but actually I don't necessarily. You know, I can have missed, like the thing with the crosses, you know, that was just an assumption I made, but I didn't even realize I'd made the assumption actually. And it was very interesting that she did pick up on it and said, no, that's not how it was here.
Yeah, it's very easy to make assumptions. I mean, Rachel, my wife, she's an author of particularly Regency romances, but she reads a lot of Regency romances, and she's forever amused, entertained by some of the anachronisms and historical errors and things like that.
So that's right.
And I mean, how important is it do you think, to readers of historical fiction that it is accurate?
I think for a lot of people, their only contact with history is through fiction.
Yeah.
And I think as a writer of historical fiction, I have a responsibility to the people whose story I'm telling to get it as accurate as possible.
Yeah.
And obviously I'm going to make mistakes because I didn't live through it. I am using my imagination. And I think that's, again, that's the thing where as the writer, what I'm trying to do is put flesh on the skeleton of the facts. But I've got to have a skeleton first.
Yes.
And if I don't have the bones, and if I don't have the skeleton, actually, do I have any right to add flesh? I'm not sure that I do. I need to have the bones in place first. I think especially if it's someone who reads a lot in that particular time period or that particular genre, I think as writers, we can lose our readers very quickly. If we put in something that's obviously not right. You know, we've got a responsibility to the people of the past, but I think we've also got a responsibility to our readers to have put in the time and put in the effort, because, you know, it might be something that is dear to them. It's something that maybe as a reader, they want to know more about it, and they want to know more about that particular story. And I have a responsibility to do that well, and to give them the right information packaged in a nice way, but to give it to them in the way that it's accurate.
Yeah, I think a lot of readers of historical fiction would say that what they enjoy learning a little bit about history while they read, without it being dumped on them, as you say, in a textbook fashion. So there is an onus.
And you know what? You can always read the textbook afterwards.
Yes.
You know, and I think that's the thing. A good historical novel should actually make people think, oh, I want to read a bit more about that. And I think that comes back to it's necessary to do a lot of background research, but it's not necessarily necessary to stuff the book with all of that facts, but at least to be able to point people and say, oh, you can also read this, you know, if you're interested in finding out some more.
So did you put a historical note at the end of your novel that just describes some of your research?
Yeah, I did for this one about Eyam, just because you know, I wanted to give credit where people had kept the archives and all of that sort of thing. And then I also gave a little bit of I kind of found out what a few of the characters had done afterwards. And I just sort of popped that in as well, just so that people kind of could see where it went to afterwards.
Well, let's talk briefly, if you don't mind, about your newer book, which is set in quite a different time period, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah. So the again, it's places that I've visited where I've kind of just had, you get that sort of like tingling up your spine of sort of, something's happened here and I want to tell the story. So this particular story, I started out by visiting Bletchley Park outside Milton Keynes, Bedford, and walking through the huts. And they've got a really great kind of reconstruction thing that's they put in a couple of the huts. And I was there and I was just like, oh, this must have been amazing. And the people who worked here, some of them were quite young, inexperienced young women who were volunteers who would have worked there, and going in the huts. And we went there in the middle of winter, and I was just thinking, oh, can you imagine sitting here and the wind blowing and the rain battering against the window, and then in summer it would have been boiling hot. And so I started out thinking I was going to write a story about Bletchley, but then I came back home and I was doing some other reading, and I actually read the book by Leo Marx. I don't know if you've ever come across it, Between Silk and Cyanide. And it's the story of the Special Operations Executive and the code breaking that was done for and by them, and the codes that were sent out with the Allied agents, So
this is all around the Second World War.
Second World War, and to do with, obviously I think everybody knows Bletchley and everybody knows the Enigma and everybody knows the kind of breaking of the codes that Germany was sending or Japan was kind of sending amongst themselves. But there's not a great deal of information, there's not a great deal of story that's told about the codes which were received from the Allied agents working in Europe, the communications that were vital for basically vital for winning the war.
Yeah. And
so those messages were decrypted by young girls working for the first aid nursing yeomanry, who were maybe in their late teens, 18, 19, maybe early 20s, who worked in these country houses around the UK, taking in these messages. And Leo Marx himself, who sort of became the head of the cryptography department, he had told the agents that there were these individuals who were working on their codes, and don't worry, if you get it wrong, there's someone who's going to solve the code. So then he had to go find the girls who would solve these messages that were coming in completely corrupted and nobody could read them. And they would spend all day, all night, thousands and thousands of attempts to figure out what these agents were communicating, just so that they wouldn't have to fire up their radio sets again 24 hours time, resend the message, potentially be found and captured. So and these girls signed the Official Secrets Act, and for 50 odd 60 years their families, even when they got married, maybe thought that they were secretaries during the war, or some of them told their families they were ambulance drivers, and their family members like, well, that's great, didn't know you could drive. But it's incredible. And then suddenly around about 1990, the stories were being told in the media, and Leo Marx wrote his book, and I wanted to explore what that would be like, that you've kept quiet for 50 or 60 years, and even your husband maybe doesn't know, your kids don't know what you did during the war, and suddenly everybody's talking about it. How do you suddenly open up and talk about what you did? So that's the premise of that story. But as you say, essentially World War II with then a modern a kind of dual timeline of exploring and kind of helping the girl unpack her history a little bit.
Right. That sounds like a fascinating concept. Just briefly, what sort of resources did you use to research that?
That one was a whole lot harder because the archives, the SOE archives, were actually destroyed in a fire in, I think, around about the 80s.
Oh, right.
So 70s or 80s. So even Leo Marx, when he was researching for his biography, he found he couldn't get a hold of a lot of his own notes because they'd been destroyed, and which was quite interesting. So a lot of that was through books and other historians, a little bit off the internet, but unfortunately for example, Q archives, if you want information about the Special Operations Executive and some of that secret work, it is available, but you have to visit Q in person in order to access those archives. So that one was a lot harder to do the research, actually, which is surprising because you think 1940s would be much easier, but than kind of 1600s. But actually, I found the 1600s much easier to research.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think I'm guessing in the same way that the census is only released after 100 years, there's a sensitivity around facts which could still be relevant to people who are alive today.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, and then again, in terms of being accurate and being responsible for the people whose stories you're telling, it can become quite difficult because, I want to be authentic and I want to tell the stories. But so one thing I did do, my parents now live just outside Oxford. My sister lives there. And when I was there last year, I managed to come over and I took a visit to, it was actually quite funny. I went to visit the main house that was used by the SOE, by these girls who were listening in on their radios and decoding all the messages, and it's now a prison. It's now one of His Majesty's prisons. And so my mom and I decided, let's just go and have a look. We'll go and have a look at this place. So we drive there. It's only about 10 minutes from where they live, and so we drive there. Now in South Africa, if you were to arrive at something like a prison, there would be lots of guards and the gates would be closed and everything.
Yes.
Arrive at this prison and it was all the gates were open and it was like, oh, okay, we can drive in. So we drove up the driveway and we drive to the top where we can kind of see near the house. And my mom gets out in the car to go see if she can find someone who can help us. And in the meantime, I go and take a photo of the house. Well, I've never seen two people come out of a office so quickly. So the one prison officer comes flying towards me and saying, you can't take photos. This is a prison. You're not allowed to take photos. I could arrest you. So in the interest of research, I nearly got arrested, but not quite. But so I did make contact with someone who has the archive for the village where the house was, Grendon Underwood, an area just outside Oxford. And I got in touch with him and it was fascinating. He had a lot of, he was basically digitizing some slides and photos that had been donated to the church in the area. So we were looking through all of these photos and it was so interesting that there were photos from kind of like the 1920s, 1930s. And then there were more photos from around about the 60s. But there were no photos. I think he found only 2 photos from during the war. And as we kind of chatted about it, we thought, it probably was because it was used by the government that presumably they wouldn't have allowed photos to be taken. And so there's very little easily accessible information and pictures and that sort of thing, which I think is, as you say, it's so recent in people's minds and in the country's history that it's still quite closely guarded, actually, which does make writing the stories a little bit harder.
I can imagine. Yeah. So your first book is called Given Lives.
Yeah.
And the second one is called Secret Lives, and these are on Amazon. And you're working on your third one right now. I don't know whether you've got a title for it, but do you want to just give
quite. It'll be something or other lives. I haven't decided what kind of lives they're going to be, but so the next story I'm going to relate a little bit more to here in South Africa, but bringing in a British element. So during the Boer War, when obviously a lot of the British and English soldiers came over here to fight against the Boer. It's a sensitive story. Even here in South Africa now, there are people who, for example, I knew one person who was never allowed to enter his home wearing his khaki scout uniform because his family had memories of the Boer War and the British wearing khaki.
Really?
So it's quite fresh in kind of just in people's, not so much in people's minds, but certainly in people's culture. It's still a story that's relevant. There's one of the main battles, or one of the most famous battles, was the Battle of Spoonkop, which took place quite close to where I live here in Durban. And when I went there recently, there was two things that really struck me. The one was in the guard hut, whenever you arrive at Spooncop, inside the hut, there's a whole lot of Liverpool memorabilia. And I was actually visiting with my dad, who is a Liverpool supporter, and he said, oh, that's because of the Kop, which is part of, people who know football, part of Anfield ground, has an area called the Kop, and is actually named after Spooncop, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
But then as you go up onto the kind of area of the battle, the first grave site that you see is to the grave of the unknown Boer soldier. And it really struck me, you know, he's not unknown. He's unknown to history, but he's not unknown to God. He's not unknown to his family. He's not unknown to his parents, to his sweetheart. And I kind of want to tell a story around that, of just, you know, when people go to war and when they fight, and you know, and then there's the inevitable casualties. Some of those casualties just get forgotten about, and they seem irrelevant, or they just are a number on a page.
Yeah.
But actually, they are people who have lived and breathed dreams and ideas and hopes, and their families had ideas for them. And so that's the story I want to tell, and probably again using the kind of dual split time medium to be able to tell the story now, but then also as a way of kind of flashback to what was actually happening at the time.
Right. Oh, it sounds like it'd be a fascinating and powerful tale, Anna.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to. I'm doing all of the reading and the research at the moment, but.
So, what sort of books do you, other than all the books you're reading for research, what novels? What sort of novels do you read?
Do you know, I actually read murder mysteries. Ones which are set in cozy English villages, you know, that sort of thing. It's my kind of hark back to when I'm, you know, kind of my childhood and so on. But so I do read a lot of that sort of thing. I love all of the you know, the kind of Anne Cleeves, Vera Stanhope stories and all of those. I think they're brilliant. I do read a lot of non-fiction anyway. You know, I like reading history books, and I like reading biographies and memoirs. So it's often when I'm reading those around a place that I've visited that then I kind of come up with a story idea. So that's mainly what I read. And then, you know, it's often if someone recommends something, I'll give it a go and try that kind of book. But I tend to gravitate back to the crime as my default.
Right.
But I don't think I'm going to be writing any murder mysteries anytime soon. I don't have the imagination to create those, that's for sure. But certainly reading is lots of fun.
You're talking to somebody who is thinking of writing their own historical novel. What sort of advice, what sort of tips would you give to that person?
I would say do your research first and then do your writing. Don't try and write and research at the same time. Just because I think it can become so confusing. You know, the idea of you've got so much information and trying to sift through what you want to put down on the page can becomes quite difficult. I think there needs to be, for myself anyway, I have to have a little bit of distance between doing the research and then getting on with the writing, you know, just to allow the story to kind of, I think, to take what was a textbook essentially, you know, to take those bones and to take the skeleton, and then it takes time to think about, well, how am I going to flesh it out? I think for historical novel writers, you can't be a pantser and just kind of go with the flow and hope that the story will flow. That doesn't work so well, but I think plotting is quite important to sort of get your timeline and get the key points of what's being written about down. But then I do find once you get into the story, so certainly with Secret Lives, once I got into the story, I was sort of changed the focus or changed the emphasis or whatever as I got going. I think is you've also got to love it. You've got to love history. You know, if you don't love history, don't even try it. Just go with something easy and come up with something from your imagination. I absolutely love taking history and writing stories that are historical in nature, but it is because I love reading history. I think, you know, if it's just a case of trying to regurgitate a story from the past without falling in love with the story, I think it's a very it's a difficult thing to do.
Well, it's been really great talking to you, Anna. Where can people find you online?
The easiest place is to actually come to my website, and then from there, then everywhere else is sort of connected to the website. So all of my books are on Amazon, but on the website, I've got links to Amazon and then to other places as well. So the website is annajensen.co.uk. And that's the easiest place to find me and connect with me. And then from there, kind of branch out and find the books and find blog posts and audios and that sort of thing. So
and social media, are you particularly active on any social media channels?
Yeah, mainly Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest a little bit. I have got a TikTok account, but I don't do too much on it. So yeah, mainly Facebook is the easy one to connect on. Facebook and Instagram are the two easiest to find me on, and those are both just Anna Jensen.
Excellent.
Easy to find me.
So you've got two books, Given Lives and Secret Lives, and a third, Something Lives, in the works.
Yes, exactly. So maybe we should have a competition. I've given the outline of what I'm telling. So now if anyone can think of a title, then you're welcome to message me and tell me.
Something Lives, set in the Boer War.
Something Lives. Yeah.
Excellent.
Right.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Anna. Thank you very much
thanks,
again for your time. And
that's great.
Yeah. Enjoy the rest of your day down there in South Africa.
Thank you. Thanks. I will.